15 years ago, my life changed forever. Though it wasn't just my life, it was my brother's as well. We've never spoken about what happened, but the silence between us is thick with the weight of it. I've never had the courage to tell him the truth, and now I'm not sure I ever will. The guilt follows me like a shadow, creeping into my thoughts at night and making me question whether I'm the sister I should have been. It all started with something so small, something that felt harmless at the time but spiraled out of control. I was just a teenager, rebellious, curious, and craving a taste of adulthood. One of my friends had dared me to smoke a cigarette, and instead of laughing it off or refusing, I took it as a challenge. I didn't even like cigarettes. The idea of it, the image, the coolness, was all that attracted me. It was more about proving something, showing that I wasn't some goody two-shoes kid who played by the rules. That day, our parents had gone out for the afternoon, leaving the house quiet and empty. I was left in charge of my little brother, Evan. He was a good kid, the type who followed the rules and looked up to me. But I was too focused on doing my own thing to pay attention to him. All I wanted was some time to myself, to sneak into the garage and have my first real rebellious moment. I remember standing in the cold, dimly lit garage, my heart racing with a mix of excitement and nerves. The cigarette felt awkward in my hand, and it took me a few tries to even light it. When I finally got it going, I took a puff and immediately regretted it. The harsh smoke burned my throat, and I coughed so hard I thought my lungs might give out. But I didn't stop. I didn't want to feel like a failure. What happened next felt like a blur. I was flicking the cigarette nervously, not paying attention to where the ashes were going, and then, in an instant, the small flicker of fire caught onto something, an old pile of newspapers stacked against the wall. I froze, staring as the flames licked up the paper, spreading faster than I could comprehend. In my panic, I dropped the cigarette and watched as the fire grew, devouring everything in its path. My mind raced, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea what to do. My instinct was to run, to get out of there before I got burned. But then reality set in. The garage was part of our house, my home. I couldn't just let it burn. I scrambled to find something, anything to put out the fire, but it was too late. The flames had already spread to the walls, climbing higher and faster than I could control. And then it hit me. My parents. They were going to be home soon, and there would be no hiding this. The damage was too great. The fire alarms blared throughout the house, and I ran, calling for my brother as I did. Evan came rushing out of his room, his eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" he yelled over the sound of the alarms, panic written all over his face. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I couldn't admit what I'd done. The fear of getting caught, of facing the consequences, overwhelmed me. Without even thinking, I pointed at Evan, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "It was him! He was playing with matches!" I'll never forget the look on his face. Confusion, hurt, and disbelief all mixed together. He didn't say anything. He didn't even try to defend himself. My brother just stood there, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to process what I'd just said. But he didn't argue. He didn't fight back. When my parents came home and saw the damage, they were furious. Half the garage was destroyed, and the fire had started to creep into the house. They demanded to know what happened. And I stuck to my story. "Evan was playing with matches," I said, my voice trembling as I lied. I tried to stop him, but it was too late. My parents believed me without question. Evan had always been the quieter, more introspective one, while I was the more outspoken sibling. I had no idea why he didn't defend himself, why he didn't point out that it was all a lie. Instead, he just stood there, taking the blame, while my parents grounded him for what felt like an eternity. Weeks turned into months, and during that time, Evan's attitude toward me changed completely. We had always been close, growing up like best friends, but after that day, something shifted. He stopped talking to me. No more jokes, no more hanging out together. It was like a wall had gone up between us, and nothing I said or did could tear it down. At first, I told myself it was just because he was mad about getting in trouble. I figured he'd get over it eventually, that we'd go back to being the way we were, but that never happened. The silence between us grew, and the guilt inside me festered like a wound that refused to heal. I wanted to tell him the truth so many times, to explain that I had been scared and didn't know what else to do. But every time I tried to muster up the courage, something stopped me. What if he hated me? What if he couldn't forgive me? I had already broken our relationship in a way I didn't know how to fix. I was terrified of making it worse. Years passed, and we grew up, but the distance between us only widened. We became strangers living under the same roof, connected by blood, but separated by the secret I was too afraid to reveal. Evan went off to college, and I stayed home for a few more years, trying to figure out what to do with my life. We barely spoke, even during the holidays when he would come back to visit. The tension was still there, unspoken but palpable. Now, 15 years later, I still live with the guilt of that day. I've built a life of my own, but there's a part of me that's stuck in the past, reliving the moment I ruined my brother's life. He doesn't talk about it, and I don't know if he even thinks about it anymore, but I do. Every single day. Sometimes I wonder if he ever knew. Did he suspect that I had lied? Did he ever put the pieces together and realize that it wasn't his fault? Or did he simply accept the blame because it was easier than confronting the possibility that his sister had betrayed him? I'll never know, because I'm too much of a coward to ask. Every time I think about coming clean, I freeze. What if telling him the truth now breaks him even more? What if it shatters whatever fragile piece he's managed to find in his life? I can't bear the thought of hurting him any more than I already have. But then again, maybe I owe him that. Maybe he deserves to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Maybe it's the only way we can ever truly move forward. I just don't know if I'm brave enough to take that step. Case 2. I did something terrible years ago, and not a single person in my family knows. To this day, I carry the weight of it, and I can't escape the guilt. It sits with me, day and night, reminding me of the selfish act that changed the course of my brother's life. I've played that moment over and over again in my head, asking myself why I did it. Was it jealousy? Was it anger? Or was it something darker? The truth is, I don't know, and I probably never will. It was a long time ago, back when I was just 16. My brother Max had always been the golden child. He was the one everyone looked up to, the smart, ambitious, driven one who had a clear path ahead of him. Max had his whole life figured out, or at least it seemed that way. He worked hard, studied even harder, and had his sights set on going to his dream school, something he'd talked about for years. It was a prestigious university, the kind of place you only get into if you're exceptional, and Max was nothing short of that. He was destined for greatness, and everyone in our family knew it. Then there was me, the younger sibling who always felt like I was living in his shadow. It wasn't that I was a bad student, or that I didn't have my own dreams, but compared to Max, I felt invisible. My accomplishments seemed smaller, less important, like they didn't really matter. My parents were always so proud of Max, constantly praising him for his achievements, while I felt like I was just there. It's not that they didn't love me, but their attention was always on him. And I guess, deep down, that bothered me more than I realized. It all started on a normal afternoon. Max had been waiting for weeks to hear back from his dream school, and the letter finally arrived. I remember the excitement in the air, the way he smiled when he saw the envelope. "This is it," he said, tearing it open with trembling hands. "Everything I've worked for." I stood in the doorway, watching him, my heart pounding in my chest for reasons I couldn't quite explain. A part of me wanted him to succeed, of course, but another part of me, one I'm ashamed to admit, felt something darker. Resentment. Jealousy. It was like all those years of living in his shadow had built up inside me. And in that moment, I couldn't stop it from taking over. Max opened the letter, his eyes scanning the page, and then, the moment I'd been dreading, his face lit up with pure joy. "I got in!" he shouted, jumping up and down like a kid on Christmas morning. "I got into my dream school!" My parents rushed into the room, hugging him, showering him with congratulations. The look on their faces was one of pure pride, and I stood there, feeling like I didn't belong. No one looked at me. No one cared about what I was feeling. It was all about Max, as it always had been. Later that night, when everyone had gone to bed, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the acceptance letter Max had left out. I don't know what came over me, but I picked it up, reading it again and again, feeling the weight of my own insecurities crush me. And then, without thinking, I did something I'll regret for the rest of my life. I grabbed a blank sheet of paper and a pen, and I forged a rejection letter. It was easy enough, Just a few lines of official-sounding text telling Max that he hadn't been accepted. I made sure it looked as convincing as possible, folding it carefully and sliding it back into the envelope. The next morning, I switched the letters. Max had no idea. He opened what he thought was his acceptance letter, but this time it was a rejection. I watched as his face fell, as the excitement drained from his eyes. He stared at the paper for what felt like an eternity, not saying a word. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind screaming at me to take it back, to tell him the truth. But I didn't. I just stood there, silent, as he crumpled the letter in his hands and walked away. That was the day everything changed. Max didn't fight it. He didn't question the rejection. He didn't call the university or ask for clarification. He just accepted it. I don't know if it was because he was too shocked or if he felt like maybe he wasn't good enough, but he gave up. Completely. He didn't apply to any other schools, didn't try to figure out another plan. He just let the rejection define him. I watched as my brother's dreams crumbled in front of me, and I knew I was the one to blame. But I couldn't bring myself to confess. Every time I thought about telling him, the fear of what he would say, what he would think of me, kept me silent. As the years went by, Max drifted through life, never finding his footing. He took odd jobs here and there, never settling on a career or going back to school. My parents were confused, wondering why their once ambitious son had suddenly lost his drive. They tried to encourage him, to get him back on track, but nothing seemed to work. Max just wasn't the same person anymore, and all the while, I stayed quiet. Now, years later, I see the toll it's taken on him. Max is struggling, barely getting by. He never talks about his dreams anymore, and it breaks my heart to see the shell of the person he's become. I know I'm the one to blame. I know that if I had just let him have that moment, if I hadn't given in to my jealousy, his life would have been different. He could have gone to college, made something of himself, lived the life he'd always wanted, but instead, he's stuck, and it's all because of me. I think about telling him the truth all the time, but I never do. The fear of what he'll say, of how he'll look at me if he finds out, keeps me from speaking up. How do you tell someone you've destroyed their life? How do you explain that one moment of selfishness has caused years of pain? I can't. I don't have the courage. So I carry the guilt with me every day, watching as my brother struggles to find his place in the world, knowing that I'm the reason he's lost. Maybe one day I'll tell him. Maybe one day I'll have the strength to own up to what I did. But for now, I remain silent, knowing that he'll never know the truth behind the lie that shattered his future.